Is black violence a problem in America? Now, there are a lot of problems in the world, and we can't address all of them. So when we say blank is a problem, we're making a relative statement because there's really only so many things that we can worry about. You're really drawing attention to something as opposed to something else, right? So it is an implicit opportunity cost when you say black violence or black crime is a problem in America. You're saying that, relatively speaking, other things are not problems. You're drawing attention away. We can really only pay attention to so many things at once. So there's a problem of emphasis, and also it draws attention to even the question of crime in general, right? Is crime in general a problem in America? What kind of crime is a problem in America? So I want to look at problems generally. What does it mean to have a societal problem? Which societal problems should we focus on? And in order to answer that question, I'm going to transport myself outside of my body, and I'm going to astrally project into the mind, theoretical body of someone who actually has the power to change things in our society. So maybe a high-level politician or a financier or a media spokesperson or a religious figure, someone who has influence and power. When this person is looking at problems, they want to be able to differentiate between two kinds of problems. And I would say that on the one hand, there are essentially systematic problems, and then there are non-systematic problems. And I've created a little list of synonyms or words that can help us describe what we mean when we say a problem is systematic. What we mean is that that problem is driven by authority, by purpose, by telos, by goals. It has a hierarchy, it's directed, it's structured, it's organized, it has the ability to discriminate, and it is intelligent. So examples of systematic or systems in general, we could say states, gangs, military, police. Non-systematic would be random, sporadic, unpredictable, disorganized, indiscriminate, dumb. These would be criminals, individual criminals, not quite gangs. The mentally ill, animals with rabies, tornadoes, etc., etc. So to give another example, let's say I have a bunch of computer parts. I have a mouse and a keyboard, and I have a monitor, and I have a GPU, and I have some memory sticks or whatever. I have all the components that could make a computer, and I just sort of throw them together randomly. And I kind of dump them out of a box onto the floor, and I say, that is a computer system. Well, it has the potentiality to be a computer system if someone takes the individual component parts and puts them in the right order together, situates them in space with respect to one another, but until that happens, it's not yet a system. And so this is the two types of problems that I think we face as a society, or that decision makers face as decision makers, is that we have to distinguish between problems which are systematic and non-systematic, because really this determines the threat level. Now understand that when we talk about something being systematic or non-systematic, this is not a quantitative assessment, this is a qualitative assessment. So if I take all my computer parts, let's say I have 100 monitors and 100 keyboards and 100 mouse pads, and I have all the things that you would need to build 100 computers, and I just dump them together, I am not any closer to having a fully functioning computer system than if I only had one of each, or something like that. And so clearly, the greater quantity, the greater potential there is theoretically for a system to arise out of that quantity. Of course, I would disagree. I could say you could have 100 dogs. It doesn't matter how many dogs you keep adding to the pile, you're never going to have a human being. Now, of course, we know that DNA is not actually eternal. We know that DNA can change over time. And so eventually, if you have enough dogs, you could actually breed dogs to have brains similar to human beings. If you believe in evolution, then you believe that at some point in our ancestral history, we had brains that were very similar to dogs. So if that happened in the past, it can clearly happen in the future. So technically speaking, if you do have enough of a quantity of something, you have enough time, you can eventually get to a quality that's assuming evolution is true. and the Shakespeare written by the gang of monkeys and so on. So people can disagree there. But I would say ultimately in the short term, if we're not talking about extremely large quantities, if we're not talking about extremely large timescales, essentially there is a gap between quantity and quality, that no matter how many random tornadoes you have, no matter how many random acts of crime you have, no matter how many mentally ill people you have, if you have non-systematic problems, these are qualitatively different from systematic problems, right? And so when we look at systematic crime and systematic violence, that's of a very different sort and a very different nature. And if we look at European history, or just history in general of states, right, the state is a system. The state is not a non-system, it is a system. And to go back to our list of words, because I want to keep running through these, a state has to have authority. And whenever you have authority, you have hierarchy. When you have that hierarchy, you have the ability to direct the forces. How do magnets work, right? I don't want to talk to a scientist about it, so let's just break it down. A magnet is a bunch of these metal molecules or atoms or whatever, iron, some kind of ferrous material, which I guess would have to be iron. Could be steel. Steel is a ferrous material, I think, built out of iron and some carbon maybe thrown in there. But anyway, you have a ferrous material, and what you do is you organize systematically all of the orbitals of the electrons. You've got your nucleus, electron field, and you somehow align those fields in such a way as the individual electromagnetic force of each electron field is made systematic. That is, individually, they all sort of cancel each other out. They're arbitrary. They're going in all different directions. They don't add up to much. There is an electromagnetic force and a piece of, if I just pick up a piece of metal, there is electromagnetic force in it, but it's not directed systematically. And so as a result, we don't say it's magnetic. It's not magnetically charged. When we align everything systematically, if we give it direction, all of a sudden that's a magnet that can pick things up. It can repulse things. Now we've got a force that's to be reckoned with. So systems are structural. They have a clear structure to them. Even if we're to go into kind of a Deleuzian, sort of a footnote here, even rhizomes sort of have a structure, the way that the root system grows, the way that the fungus grows. There's still a structure to it. It doesn't just grow as a clump. It doesn't just grow as a ball. It sort of has these roots and shoots, and it has certain forms that replicate and mirror. There's a fractal effect, right, we could say, with the rhizome. So there is a structure to it. Even in that case, we could say, it doesn't have to be hierarchical to be a structure. I would say, structure is what differentiates just random noise. If I have a bunch of dice and I just roll them randomly, I get a bunch of random numbers. That's not structured. But if I have dice and I somehow, tape them together or something so that they're basically all facing in the same direction, then when I roll those dice together, I'm going to get much more predictable numbers, much less chaotic results. There has to be organization. There has to be the ability to discriminate. When the mushroom hits up against a wall, the mushroom can't just keep trying to grow into the wall. It has to say, oh, that's a wall. I better stop. I feel pressure. I feel a repelling force. I'm going to go in the opposite direction. Or the mushroom encounters a really hot, sunny, dry area. The mushroom says, I don't want to keep growing in that direction. I'll grow where it's dark and wet and dank. So it has to have the ability to discriminate, even if it is a diffused model of discrimination. And then it has to have some kind of intelligence, some kind of perceptual ability. To go back to the non-systematic problem, it's just random, it's sporadic. It's unpredictable, disorganized, indiscriminate, dumb. And when you're looking at these two problems, again, bringing it back to the example of warfare, prior to the outbreak of a war, and this was especially true for World War I, things can be eerily quiet, eerily peaceful. There is no organic, quote-unquote, natural slope between deaths in peacetime and deaths in wartime. It's not like there's this slow, gradual buildup. It's not like, things were kind of tense. The Germans started getting angry at the French. All of a sudden, the Germans start, making little small incursions into France at first. First, they sort of randomly wander into France and they start murdering Frenchmen, and the French do it back. At first, just a few deaths, and then it's like 10 deaths a week, and then per day, and then you've got 100 deaths and 1,000 deaths, and all of a sudden we've got millions of men mobilized, and we're having battles with hundreds of thousands of people, and tens of thousands of people are dying. You don't have that slow, gradual buildup because it's not just random, it's not just sporadic. And I guess we could view, if we really want to point out the Deleuzian or rhizomatic exception, or put it as a third category, between true chaos, and then you have sort of the rhizome in the middle, and then you have something that's extremely hierarchical. That is, Germans and French, they don't kill each other at all. And of course, we saw the Christmas truce, where the Germans and the French just stopped killing each other, which showed you that these Germans and French were completely controlled hierarchically by the authorities of the state, who told them to kill each other, because the moment they were told to stop killing each other, it was easy. They didn't have to resist the urge, oh, I really want to kill this Frenchman right now, or I really want to kill this German, but I can't. And we didn't see that. The Germans and French were completely fine to be peaceful. Of course, socialists pointed this out, and pacifists pointed this out as there's no reason these people need to be fighting except for the state. Of course, if we remove the state, we're going to have a lot of problems out of that as well. By completely removing authority, hierarchy, whatever, you create a power vacuum, and the idea that nothing is going to come in and fill that power vacuum, a little bit ridiculous, but we have these two categories of problems, and I hope you understand the difference between the two, in that non-systematic problems, like shark attacks, like lightning strikes, problems that are problems, they do hurt people, they kill people, they cause pain, they cause sadness, they're negative, right? We want to avoid these things, we want to fight against these things, we don't wish these things upon people, right? But these non-systematic problems, they are, in their unpredictability, they're sort of predictable. That is, when people die in car crashes, no one gets upset because, well, that was just a random freak of nature. It was an accident. It was undirected. It was not premeditated. It was just, it was what it was, And at some point, it's a tragedy, but it's not something that really threatens the system of power that we have. It's not something that threatens the state that we have. It's not something that proposes an alternative state. When someone has a car crash, we don't say, oh my gosh, this threatens religion, this threatens the government, no. It's a car crash, it's tragic, people die. About 30,000 people die a year of car crashes in America, but it doesn't really go further than that. We don't consider banning cars, for instance. But I can tell you that if, an enemy attacked America, let's say we had 10 9/11s in a day. Let's say they didn't just bring down the World Trade Center, they didn't just attack the Pentagon, but they also attacked Los Angeles and Chicago and Miami and Dallas and some other big cities. They attacked 10 big cities and they caused 3,000 people to die in each of them. We had 30,000 dead. I can tell you, we'd be willing to spend more than whatever the total GDP of the United. What do we make? Was it like $6 trillion a year or something? Is it higher or lower than? I can't keep up with these trillions. But in any case, the entire United States GDP is on the level of some number of trillions of dollars, right? And so I'm sure that the government would be willing to spend more than that amount of money just to fight against whatever enemy had just, attacked us with 30,000 dead. Now, in terms of quantitative analysis, there's absolutely no difference between an enemy attacking us, 30,000 people dying in a directed, systematic, intentional, structured, organized attack, and 30,000 people dying a year in car crashes. Both of them are just as tragic. Both of them, cause people to lose loved ones. Both of them cause a lot of pain and suffering. But they present very different challenges to the existing system of power. And so when people say things like, okay, well, when a black person is killed by a cop, everyone freaks out. But if a black person kills a cop, then people don't freak out. That is hypocritical, is the argument that's being made. I would say, no, that's not hypocritical. That is a quantitative analysis. That is an inability to understand qualitative differences in violence. There's a qualitative difference between a lightning strike killing somebody and a terrorist attack killing somebody. There's a qualitative difference between a terrorist slamming their car into a crowd of people intentionally and a drunk driver accidentally going off the road and slamming into a crowd of people. Those are two very different qualitative situations. Same number of people can die in either one, but two very different situations that really demand two very different responses, because what they represent alternatively is a non-systematic problem versus a systematic problem. And as you see with something like World War II, there's a huge difference, or World War I, there's a huge difference between systematic violence and non-systematic violence in terms of the potential to upset the ordering of things, the power structure. So these are two very different things. I don't know how much more I can explain this and put forth to people, but this is one of the reasons why I'm sort of sick and tired of conservatives and racist conservatives and people who talk about race all day as the most important thing and blah, blah, blah. And they point out the FBI statistics and they say, look at the left and the liberal hypocrisy. You know, they'll point out the one example, you know, that when the black guy gets shot by a cop, oh, everyone freaks out. But if the black guy shoots the cop, oh, no one cares. Or if it's, you know, well, why should it matter if it's a cop or not? You know, if a black guy kills anyone, it should be a problem. And look, we can post pictures of faces of people. And it's totally ignoring the fact that black people do not have the ability to, like, take over the government or something like that. They just don't have that ability. I mean, maybe there are some diehard black nationalists out there who think that they can. Certainly, like the Black Panthers or something did believe in a kind of separatism, and they thought they were going to have their own homeland back in like the 1970s. So I'm sure maybe there's some people who believe that, but I think most reasonable people understand that no, you know, black people in America don't have the ability to do that. Now, if the police decided as an institution, systematically, that they were going to take over America, I mean, the police have a pretty good shot at doing that. Now, how many police officers are in America? We have a country of, what, 350 million people. And so if we assume that 1 out of 100 is a cop, which is pretty gratuitous, but if we went ahead and assume that, then we could say that maybe there are 3.5 million cops in America. On the other hand, there are about 40 million black Americans. About 20 million of them are men. Maybe 10 of them are possibly fighting age men who could pick up a weapon with their Second Amendment rights. So we're saying that really, you know, fighting age black Americans outnumber cops by about 3 to 1 or more, depending on how we count it. We could throw the military in there and make it a little more unbalanced. But ultimately, it's about directionality. It's about you have an institution. And if that institution has a racial bias, that's way more impactful than if, you know, a random disorganized ethnic group, people who loosely associate, maybe people who vote for a political party or whatever. When you're dealing with a group that is institutional, that is hierarchical, that is structured, if it has even a slight racial bias, that could have huge effects. I mean, effectively, again, we look at the history of states and war. I mean, something like that can lead to, you know, really kind of these gigantic cataclysmic historical events. Whereas, you know, a group of people who are a dispossessed minority, who don't have their own homeland, who are just kind of dissatisfied and angry and might occasionally lash out at the system and commit random acts of violence, but they're not doing it in a systematic way, they're not doing it in a structured way, that's not really a threat to the system, right? So these are two fundamentally different acts in the fact that, well, we can point out two things where, like, the casualty rate is the exact same, and yet the media only focuses on one over the other. Well, how, I mean, to even call that hypocritical to me misses the point. You're missing even the reason why the media is doing this, and why these people are so, these conservatives, these racists, these Jared Taylor types, they seem to be dumbfounded. And at some point, it's hard to differentiate between if they're just making a rhetorical point to appeal to people who haven't really thought this through, or if they genuinely believe it, or if it's a weird mix of the two. But they'll say things like, I don't understand. Don't these people understand? Doesn't the government understand that if this crime gets out of hand, don't they understand that every time they point out a cop shoots a black man, don't they understand that what's really more important is black crime? Just look at the FBI statistics. Just look at the number of murders and just look at the casualty rates. And don't you understand? And you can do all that kind of statistics. That's a quantitative analysis. But you're not doing a systematic analysis. You're not doing a qualitative analysis. And so there's this weird bewilderment, this weird surprise that I would compare to the libertarian psychology, where the libertarian says things like, I don't understand why people are inconsistent. I don't understand why the people treat the state as if it's like God. I don't understand why people vote against their interests. I don't understand, and it just keeps going on and on like this with libertarians, where they're just continually surprised at how people act against their interests, or, how people think religiously, or this is just weird, this is zany, and we need to move away from this. We need to go into a hyper-rationalist libertarian mode where everyone thinks like me. Usually, and that's assuming it sometimes a lot of lack of introspection on their part in terms of conceiving of themselves as a hyper-rational individual. A lot of times they don't analyze their own worshipful ways, the things that they idolize and that they ignore. But in any case, I think these psychologies are very similar, which is why I think there's a pipeline from the libertarian psychology into this conservative, racialist, Jared Taylor type psychology, where it's like, if only the elite just knew, if only they just understood that really, the media is just blowing this story out of proportion, and that if we look at the statistics, it's really something different. That's just ignoring a qualitative analysis, and it maybe, I know the whole left brain, right thing has been discredited in terms of, it's not like one side of the brain is quantitative, the other side is qualitative, but I think there is a certain psychological type or tendency among men to over-quantize things often, to look at things as a numbers game, to just look at, okay, well, I have X number of resources here, X number of resources there, this is the bigger pile, so I choose that. And they're not really understanding the qualitative aspects. This is oftentimes why I think, I don't know if this is something that we could go into the dating scene and ask, why are men so confused about what women want, is possibly because they're looking at a qualitative or quantitative approach. They say, well, I have this, 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 and this. Why don't girls like me? Why aren't they attracted to me? Like an Elliot Rodger type. There's just this continual surprise and frustration and feeling of betrayal that I have all the necessities, and for some reason the girl doesn't like me. I have all the good arguments, but for some reason the elites won't listen to me. Maybe they just haven't been red-pilled. Maybe we just need to convert millions of people, and then maybe the elite will finally wake up and listen to us and realize that, their class interests are the same as ours because we're all part of the same race, right? But that's ignoring the way that power works. It's ignoring the fact that really, if you're a rich person, you have fundamentally different interests from someone who is middle class or lower class. And then even within this group called rich people, we have even further divisions between someone who's a billionaire and someone who's a millionaire. And then even then we have to question, if you're really, really rich, couldn't you just control Forbes? When Forbes publishes the list of the world's richest people, if I was the world's richest person, I would not want that known to people. And so I wouldn't allow Forbes to publish that information. I would hide my money. And if anyone tried to investigate how rich I really was, I would have them done away with because I would just be that rich, right? So that's a hypothetical. I don't think that's, I don't want to use the C word. I don't want to use it too frequently, but maybe that's just a crazy hypothesis, but it is a hypothesis that sort of is unfalsifiable, that there could be even richer people than billionaires that we just don't know about, because if you had enough power, it seems like you could really effectively control the channels of information and prevent people from knowing that you even existed, which I don't think is necessarily a useful tidbit, but it at least explains this perspective that the quote-unquote rich is not just a monolith, that there is a huge difference between someone who's a millionaire and a billionaire. We could go on and on about that, but I guess to get back to the main point, there's a certain psychology that gets wrapped up in statistics and scientifies, I don't know what the word I'm trying to use here, but making everything scientific, making everything this empirical question of what's the data say, and we just have to believe the data, and eventually, like, the human species is just destined, like, if we just explain the data, people will just get on board, and that's how it works, and it takes a while because, I don't know where this progressive narrative of, like, first we were animals, and we just did everything completely wrong, and then we became human beings, and now we're progressively doing everything right, and that just means more data, more quantity, more science. To me, is just ignoring, I don't know, and you could try to quantize qualities, right? We can create not just two-dimensional graphs, we can create three-dimensional, we can create n-dimensional graphs where we can mathematically model certain qualities, right? We could do this in a Lockean way. We can say, well, for any given object, even theoretical abstract objects, we can describe them with qualities, and we could say systematization is a certain quality. We could break that down into how much is authority concentrated in this system, how much is it hierarchical, how much is it directed. We could assign values, comparative relative values. We could create all kinds of models in order to describe that using models which are greater than 3 dimensions. But the problem with those kinds of models is even if they did theoretically work, it would require that we basically juggle more than 3 dimensions in our head at once, which is very difficult for most people to do, especially when you're just trying to make political arguments on the internet and convince people of your position. Generally, you want to keep the number of variables to 3 or less. And maybe this is something that's just intrinsic to all life in the universe, is that we have to deal with these 3 dimensions that we're given. Maybe that's something that's kind of just an objective facet of our environment. Maybe that's something that's particular to human beings. I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's something that's particular to the culture. There's a lot of kind of origin stories that we could have for this, but ultimately I think we are sort of limited when we talk about what is the big problem, what are the big solutions. Solutions are always reacting to problems, and so this kind of rule of 3 means that it's very hard if you're a quantitative thinker. Theoretically, you can transpose your quantities into essentially a qualitative mapping by having all these variables and graphing them in n-dimensional space, but that's very difficult for most people to do on the fly. And maybe you can do that with a computer and have the computer do the work for you. But if you're doing that, essentially, you're offloading the quantitative aspect onto the computer, and while you're inputting is really qualitative aspects. So I think at the end of the day, qualitative understanding is important, and I think that really people who are more, women tend to get this a little bit more intuitively. I think they're able to assess power structures a little bit better. I think they're able to, because, right, that's their whole reproductive incentive, is to find out where the power is. If you can't do that as a woman, then you've got a huge problem. If, as a woman, if you don't know who the powerful men are in the group, or what the power structure is, or what the social setup is, then you're going to invest your healthy reproductive years really badly if you're just doing it randomly. The successful strategy is, as a woman, to be able to be very selective, very choosy, and it doesn't mean that you're necessarily monogamous, but it means that you're really focused in intuitively, qualitatively on where power lies in that grouping, in your social setting. Whereas for men, a little less investment, and so it's less about, okay, I really need to discern which of these women has the highest social standing or something like that. It doesn't really matter. It's more quantitative. It's more like, okay, I just need to gather resources so that I have access to women, or I just need to be with a bunch of women, or I'm just attracted to the physical features. I'm just attracted to how the woman looks, and these sort of things. So I think men are less adept at gathering this kind of intuitive social understanding, and women tend to be better at it. And so the more hyper-masculine, especially intelligent men, will create these very sophisticated data streams, and they'll really, pump study after study, be very scientific about it, and just show you conclusively that, look, this number is higher than this number, and we've done all the work necessary to gather all the data. We've been very methodical. We have a 35-page research paper. In fact, we have hundreds of these research papers, hundreds of hours, and just continually, like an engineer, like a worker bee, just continually plugging themselves into the matrix and figuring out all the math and just continually doing that, and then expecting at the end of the day that that is how things are going to change, or that those are even the problems that need to be solved or addressed. When in fact, I think the problems that need to be solved and addressed are the systematic problems. And so we kind of have to ask the question, if black crime and black violence is not a systematic problem, and really it is the police wherein the problems lie, at least as an example here. Right now, of course, the police are not the most important institution. They are an important institution, but probably not the most important, because we do have a hierarchy of class in America. The police are not an autonomous structure. They are, of course, controlled by the laws, and the laws in this country are written by a legislature, and that legislature is very vulnerable to lobbying power, because the legislature is elected according to a democratic system, which is, and people vote according to what they know, and they only know what the media presents them with, and the media exists insofar as it is funded by vast quantities of money. So we can see this hierarchy in the way that essentially the police are subjugated to the media, and the media is subjugated to the financial class. And so the police are not autonomous. Therefore, I wouldn't lay all the problems in America at the feet of the police. But just by laying that out for you, I hope I've indicated where I'm going with this, is that if we want to understand where responsibility lies in the world globally for any sort of problems that we have, systematic problems, not the random problems, not the problems of the shark bites and the thunder strikes and the tornadoes and the rabies and so on. And sure, there are things you can do to decrease the incident of random death and random pain, and that's good. Like we probably should. If there's lightning outside, go under a covering, stay in your car. If there is, and that's always a funny one, people say, oh, you need to get out of your car, the lightning's going to shock you and kill you, which is hilarious. But we're not going to get into that. We're not going to get into the way in which rubber is a very poor conductor, and the way that the reason lightning hits the ground is because it's creating a circuit between the earth and the sky. It has to connect in that way, and if you've got rubber in between your metal car and the ground, then it can't really complete that, and it's not going to strike there for that reason. But that's a digression. Okay, so we can tell people, don't go in the water if there's sharks in the water, and maybe buy a Tesla so you don't have a car accident, or whatever maybe Teslas are going to give you a car accident, I don't know. But there are surely ways that we can reduce non-systematic violence and non-systematic problems, but I would say that no matter what situation you're in, it's always better to address the systematic problems. It's always better to prioritize those above the non-systematic problems. Essentially, you're dealing with the question of friction versus some kind of active component that's aggressing against you. If you're running a race and there's the wind resistance is slowing you down, well, I guess you could run faster if you're running in a vacuum. Probably more important is like the guy who's trying to push you off the track, or like the stones trying to trip you up, or I don't know, something that's really active and aggressive and systematic and directional. If you have wind on all sides of you, if you have wind coming from the north, south, east, and west all at the same time, essentially those forces cancel each other out. They don't really have an effect on your speed. But if you have someone who is a concerted gust of wind, he's got his leaf blower and he's pointing it at you, that's a problem. So that's how we have to look at problems, and therefore we have to understand class. We have to understand these hierarchies. And if we're thinking in terms of, it's the police versus black Americans, and you have to choose a side, and that's what's important, that's obviously a distraction, right? That's a distraction from how decisions are actually made. And so once we understand how decisions are actually made and we understand this qualitative analysis, then we can start prioritizing in our own lives, our own actions, what is important. What's important is not, oh, well, look at this story of this person getting killed and this incidental violence. What's important is to understand that we're in these systems and power is very centralized. It's not decentralized as the liberal narrative goes, is that everything just becomes freer and freer as we go on. That's not true. Socialists really are the ones who predicted this and who gave the correct understanding. People like George Orwell said, look, humanity is not like teleologically determined to just head toward more freedom. That's just fantasy, right? That's just an assertion that has no basis in reality. And we can assert the contrary, which actually turns out to be much more accurate, which is that freedom can increase in certain respects, to certain degrees, in certain ways, and then other ways it can decrease. So we have to understand that even though things present as very decentralized, they're actually very centralized. And the way that they're centralized is really through religion. It is through the way that we have, in Freud's words, the way that we construct totem and taboo, what we're attracted to, what we're repulsed by. That is what determines how people live their lives and how society functions, is ultimately about worship. It's ultimately about religion. It's ultimately about what is the worst thing in the world, what is the best thing in the world. What can you do, what can't you do? It is about religion. And so that is really, if you are to achieve any sort of change at all in this society, you have to address that. I mean, even we can say, oh, well, no, it's not a religious system because that would be priestly. What we have is a financial system. We have a merchant system. But I would make the argument that a merchant system is dependent upon religious belief. The idea that a dollar has value is a religious belief. And you can say, no, I don't believe it has value, but everyone else around me says it has value. Well, that's the same thing as if everybody goes to church on Sunday and everyone sort of privately says, oh, well, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in Jesus, but everyone else does, so I just play along and I pretend to be a Christian. Well, effectively, de facto, you're part of the religion. You might say, well, I don't directly believe in God, I just go to church because everyone else believes in God. Then that's just a kind of abstracted belief, right? Now, instead of directly believing in God, you believe in the authority of the church. So that's kind of what I mean by religion, is that it's our belief in authority. You believe a dollar has value. You believe that death is scary and that you should avoid it. You believe that social opprobrium is scary and you should avoid it. You believe that embarrassment is scary and you should avoid it. You believe that being shamed or something is scary and you should avoid it, right? And you believe these things with respect to certain contexts. So not just in a vacuum, I think objectively people don't like to be bullied, and it doesn't matter how you're being bullied. It doesn't matter if you're being bullied by people who are ideologically aligned with you or ideologically opposed to you. I think actually it's easier if someone who is opposed to you, like if you're a right-wing person and you get bullied by the left, or you're on the left and you get bullied by the right, I think you can kind of have a martyr complex about it, which is not an entirely harmful thing. It's a defense mechanism to help preserve the integrity of our personality and not go into a mental breakdown. We can say, oh, well, the reason I'm being attacked is because I'm effective, and that means I'm doing the right thing, and I'm righteous, and I'm going to die for this cause. There's this martyr complex, which is powerful, and which is really adaptive, and it's a good thing that we can hack into that. Whereas if you're getting attacked by your own side, that's a little more brutal because it's harder to develop a martyr complex if the people agree with you in a religious or ideological sense. But really, it's not fun to be bullied from any side, so people, of course, want to avoid that, and that's necessary. It's necessary that we should want to avoid bullying as individuals, because our receptivity to shame and guilt is the way that we can have a society without constant violent enforcement of social mores. Because if we didn't feel any guilt or shame at all, we would all be sociopaths. And if you have a society full of sociopaths, you can't really cooperate and act as a collective. So we need guilt and shame. It's necessary. unless we just want to have complete Conan the Barbarian, just might is right, just everyone just slaughtering each other all the time. Some people would enjoy that. Some people would benefit in that kind of a society. There's a problem with that, though, in the case that you can have your super barbarian Viking society, and then you can have the Soviet Union, which is full of like communist bugmen, and they're going to beat you because they can invest in technology, and they might be per capita weaker than you, but they can still defeat you. So there's that problem of quantity over quality there. But we're talking about let's roll back. We're talking about sociopathy. We're talking about bullying. We're talking about the ways that people are affected by bullying, how they're so we're afraid of bullying, right? Which sometimes is necessary. It's necessary that people feel bad when they are shamed. It's necessary that we have a sense of shame and guilt about things. But the question is, who is your God? Who is your authority? Who determines where you feel shame? Everyone needs to feel guilt and shame at some point. If you do something that's wrong, you need to feel guilt and shame. And we can't be nihilistic. We can't just have no values at all, because then life just falls apart. So we need values, we need guilt and shame, but the question is, who is your God? Is your God the God that tells you should be guilty and shameful for, I don't know, being fat? Is your God the God that tells you to be guilty and shameful for shaming people for being fat? Right? So ultimately, to me, this is a question of religion, and people want to be pedantic and say, oh, well, that's not religion, because religion requires a belief in God, and, someone can be, your position on fat shaming has nothing to do with God at all. That's such a narrow-minded view of religion, which is really a product of a post-Christian society, right? It's the inability to look back at paganism and to understand the pagan psychology, in which you have all these different various gods, right? In the same way that there are some people who are Star Wars fans, and there's some people who are Star Trek fans, and there's some people who hate Star Wars. And essentially, these are different religious communities. In the same way that, we call these cultures, we call them cultures, but, I think at some point we have to recognize that the distinction between culture and religion breaks down at a certain point. It's still a useful distinction insofar as we can speak of a culture really as something that you're born into, and you can say you're born into religions as well, but I think religions have a greater degree of choice, whereas you're born, by the time you're like age 18 or whatever accent you have, you're going to have for the rest of your life. It's going to be very difficult to get rid of that accent. Let's say after your 30s or something. Very difficult to change your accent. I think Madonna did it, but very difficult to change your accent permanently, your natural speaking accent. Very different to change your taste in food at some point. The food you like, the food you grew up with, mom's cooking, whatever. That is what you're going to like for the rest of your life. It's not really a choice. It's the thing you're acculturated to, the kind of songs you like, the kind of music you like. We could say maybe there's more of a religious component to this with like goth, emo, screamo, various types, grunge, hip-hop, rap, whatever. We can keep listing genres here. But you're kind of born into that, and it's not something, I think there's a deep link between culture and religion. Like I said, at some point they sort of fuse together and there's no meaningful distinction. But, I guess colloquially when we talk about culture, oftentimes we're talking about things that you're just kind of born into, you're plopped into, whether it's because of your appearance, whether it's because of your ancestry, whether it's because of the region you grew up in, whatever, that's something you're just born into, whereas religion is this constant, conscious affirmation of this is who I am, this is what I believe, I am a Christian, I go to church, I do these things, whereas you can be a southerner who moves to the north, or a northerner who moves to the south, or an easterner who moves to the west. You can be of a certain culture and then move into a different cultural zone, and you can still say, well, ultimately I have the same accent, ultimately I like the same food, and ultimately, this is who I am, but you're not actively practicing that. I think religion has the aspect of being an active practice. That is, you're having daily thoughts about your religion. You're going through daily practices about your religion. And there are some people who are more religious and some people who are less religious. And I would say people who are very quantitative often miss this point because they're like, well, I don't have a religion, I just like playing video games. And to that extent, I would say your religion is playing video games, right? It's not just playing video games, but that's a component of that. Again, going back to paganism, this is the polytheistic model of religion, that it's not just that there's one God. That's the post-Christian perspective, but the polytheistic perspective is that we have many different gods. We worship video games, we worship pornography, we worship the state, we worship politicians, we worship celebrities, we worship political movements, we worship whatever. We worship ourselves, we worship hedonic experience, just the pleasure of playing a video game, the pleasure of sexuality, these kind of pleasures in a basic Freudian sense. Oftentimes we do derive pleasure simply because it's sensuous, simply because of our instincts, simply because on an animal level. And maybe if you wanted to make a hardcore argument, you could say, well, that's not religious. Animals are not religious. You know, I would say that animals have the most primitive religion possible. I would say all life is animated by religion in some way, or spirituality, or whatever. There's a spirit there. There's a driving force. In a Schopenhauerian sense, there's a will. There's a will, and the question is, how is your will aligned? And the question of how different wills are aligned is a question of religion. Is your will headed toward Islam, Judaism, Christianity, atheism, liberalism, conservatism, and these fractal, and they create all these little subspecies and sub-religions that we call sects. And when they become political, we call them different political groupings and subgenres of different political factions. But they all sort of operate in the same way. I think we've taken something that's existent in animals, that animals have a will, and the religion of the animal is, how do I survive, right? That's how the will is directed. Now that we have this mythic consciousness structure and then this mental consciousness structure, we can abstract into religion. Now it's not just a question of survival, it's a question of how do I live up to these principles, these ideals, these laws. And so essentially the atheist is an animal, right? When we see the depiction of the atheist as, the atheist thinks that his grandparents were apes. Now, of course, I believe in evolution, so it's a little bit of a silly joke there, but I think on a psychological, even spiritual level, there's something true there, that atheists really only think in terms of animal spirits, animal instincts, animal pleasures, animal hedonism. I do it because it's good. I do it because it's quantitatively right and it makes sense. Whereas they're not capable of going into the realm of myth and understanding these qualitative differences, right? They're just looking at quantities. They don't have this mythic aspect. It's like, from an animalistic or secular perspective, like if you tell an animal a myth, the animal just doesn't understand all your symbology. Animal doesn't understand language. Animals only understand direct experience. And in the same way, the pure empiricist only understands direct experience. The pure empiricist doesn't understand these qualitative differences. And it was Brian G. who posted the comment, Xenophanes was critical of Hesiod and Homer because they were too mythic. And he felt that this mythic mysticism was sort of, destroying the naturalistic original Greek superstition about, the god of the river and the god of the trees and the gods of nature and the elemental forces, and that they were anthropomorphizing too much and they were particularizing too much and they were making too much myth. And so in a way, from the way Brian G. was representing this, he was saying that there was basically a folding back or a horseshoe where you start off as a kind of animalistic, magical, spiritual, loosely religion or whatever you want to call that, animism, and then you move into the mythic, and then you get back to the mental, which is trying to sort of return to the animalistic in a way. And so there's like this link between the secular and the magical, even though we think of themselves as on this opposite ends of this process, they're kind of tying back together in a way. And of course, then you would probably move into a new mythic phase and blah, blah, blah. And I would argue that really what Christianity did is it took a very secularized Greco-Roman world and it re-mythicalized that universe. And I when I take this substantive or this noun and I try to change it into a verb, it never works out. But I also want to address a question by Mr. Coolmug, who asked me how sexuality was like animism. This is a while back. This was a question that I read it and I was multitasking or whatever, and I said I'll get back to that and never did. So sexuality is like animism, because animism looks at things, looks at objects, and it fetishizes or tabooizes. I don't know what the opposite of fetishize would be, but it essentially imbues objects with power. So you see the river, you see the flowing river, and you have the sense that the river is a living god. And you're looking at it and you're like having an experience, and the river's speaking to you, and like you want to go drink of its waters, and like, you know, all of a sudden, like in your mind space, like it's like the river mother, and you know, all this weird stuff. And the same thing with all the other features of the environment for the animist. The animist is looking at the environment constantly, like, and of course we can see how this moves into like a schizophrenic anthropomorphization, as I've already implied with the like the river mother, which I don't know if that's a historically accurate way to describe things. I don't know that rivers were associated with a mother archetype necessarily. I think oftentimes rivers are feminine, at least. But in any case, so we're talking about the way that, you know, kind of getting ahead of myself, the way that animism can then transform into a mythic structure by, okay, well, now the river is a woman. Okay, well, if it's a woman, what does the woman look like? And okay, well, the woman, it's not actually the river, but it's a woman who controls the river. And then, wait, it's not a woman who controls the river, it's a woman who has qualities like a river. Okay, what would those qualities be? Okay, so she's like a life bringer, a life giver. Okay, now she's the Mother Mary. Okay, now she's a historical figure. Okay, now she's a politician. You know, and so we can see how that thing progresses. But to get back to the animism and sexuality question, is that when I would say that animism is the closest form of religion that humans can have to the animal experience. That is, animals, the way that I perceive animals experiencing their environment is that animals go around and they see things and they're attracted and they're repulsed, and they're attracted and they're repulsed. And of course, sometimes they're kind of tired and neutral and they just want to take a nap. But when they see food, they smell food, they experience their sensory ecology, they're attracted and they're repulsed. And sexuality is very much about attraction and repulsion. And sexuality is the most basic and elemental part of the human consciousness. And so I would say that really sexuality and animism are bridges or gateways to the animal experience. If you want to know what would it be like to be an animal, just be violent all day and be very sexual. And when you're tapping into violence and sexuality, you're tapping into these ancient animal structures in the mind. And in a way, you can like reconnect and re-experience what it would be like millions of years ago to actually be like prior to the evolution of the human mind. You can tap into that. So that's the way in which I say animism, the worship of objects, like when a man is attracted to a woman's body, it's not necessarily an ideology, right? I think oftentimes women try to do that. They'll say things like Adam Driver is so non-problematic. I just, you know, Adam Driver, you know, it's like, what kind, that's like the least sexy word ever, non-problematic. It's like a negative feature. It's like, he's so not poor. It's like, what are you even doing there? So there are certain feminists that try to make attraction very ideological. Men don't seem to care so much. Men say, I don't care whether you're left wing, right wing, whatever. You know, if it's an attractive woman, it's just an attractive woman. So women are basically, in the realm of sexuality, they seem to have a greater capacity for socialization, abstracting, and making things ideological. And putting them in a social context or an economic context, whereas men are just sort of looking at the object, or the aesthetic form in itself. And I would compare that to the animal experience. So in this way, I think men are more animalistic than women, because women, their sexuality, and I'm not going to say that it's a hard and fast distinction. Of course, we can describe elements of female sexuality that are very animalistic. But on this point, at least, I would say that men are closer to animal sexuality, because men, their sexuality is animistic. That is, they're looking at visual forms, they're looking at their environment, they're kind of living in this dream state, and the woman appears to them, and they become enthralled with the appearance of the women. I'm not saying that women can't do this with men, but I'm saying that there's a shift in that direction toward the animistic, animalistic experience of, you just see something visually, something just strikes you, you're sort of this passive recipient of this experience, of this visual thing coming into your your framework, your vision, and it just captures you. And you just worship it. And you're just like, I'm going to do everything possible to pursue this. Whereas with women, I think there is an element of calculation, social, economic, political, ideological calculation that goes into their understanding of who is attractive, who's not attractive. Now, of course, obviously, if a man is very physically well built in a lot of ways, then, you know, a woman is going to, in the same way that men are attracted to physicality, women are also attracted to physicality. So I'm not making an absolute statement, I'm making a relative statement. And I think that's the connection animism has with sexuality. I guess I'll try to leave it there and see what criticisms people have. We did it in under an hour. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.